Welcome to the deep dive. Whether you're driving, taking a walk, or just, taking a break, thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Yes, thank you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Because today we are diving into something that, well, it's universally experienced, but we almost never admit it out loud.
Oh, absolutely. It's a very taboo topic in a lot of ways.
Right. Usually when a relationship ends, there is a smoking gun.
Right.
Like a massive betrayal, a screaming match in a crowded restaurant, or just a clear boundary that was crossed.
You have a villain, basically.
Exactly. You can point to it and say, there it is. That is the villain of this story. But what happens when a relationship dies of natural causes?
That is the big question.
Right. What happens when you look at someone you've known for a decade, someone who is objectively a good person, and you realize you just don't belong in the same room anymore?
It is incredibly disorienting.
It really is. So our mission today is to unpack the psychological mechanics behind outgrowing people. Why does this entirely natural evolution feel so much like a betrayal?
And we're going to explore how to distinguish genuinely healthy personal growth from what is sometimes just disguised arrogance.
Yes, which is a fine line, and we'll map out exactly how to navigate the relationships in your life that are shifting right now.
It is arguably one of the most difficult relational landscapes human beings have to navigate.
Because there's no bad guy.
Exactly. When you introduce the concept of outgrowing a peer, you are entirely stripping away the easy narrative of victim and perpetrator.
And the brain hates that, doesn't it?
Oh, it despises it. You are left with a situation where a profound emotional loss is occurring, but there is absolutely no one to blame.
Wow.
And psychologically speaking, the human brain is exceptionally poorly equipped to handle ambiguity without a designated threat.
I mean, we want to know who the enemy is.
Right. We are hardwired to categorize people as allies or enemies. So outgrowing someone forces them into this gray area that triggers a massive amount of cognitive dissonance.
I want to start right there in that gray area, because honestly, just saying the phrase out loud feels transgressive.
It feels wrong.
Yeah. If I tell you, my friend and I just changed over the years, that sounds perfectly fine, benign even.
Very neutral.
But if I say I've outgrown my friend, I instantly feel like a narcissist. I feel like I'm sitting on a throne looking down at them. Why is the guilt so immediate?
Well, the guilt stems directly from the semantics we use. The words are deeply loaded with evolutionary and social implications.
What do you mean by loaded?
So the word outgrown inherently implies a vertical trajectory. It suggests that you have leveled up.
Like I'm above them now.
Exactly. It implies that you have ascended to a higher plane of maturity or success, and the other person has just stagnated at the bottom. It implicitly signals superiority.
But that's not actually what's happening most of the time, right?
No, at all. The psychological frameworks we are examining today point out that in the vast majority of cases, this phenomenon is not vertical, it is horizontal.
Horizontal. Okay, I like that.
You haven't moved above them, You've just moved away from them. Your core values, your daily priorities, or even just your risk tolerances have simply diverged.
So it's not climbing a ladder, it's like walking down a fork in the road.
That is a perfect way to put it. But to understand why we feel so guilty about taking that fork, we have to look at the evolutionary psychology of tribal belonging.
Oh, right, because of how we used to live.
Exactly. For our hunter-gatherer ancestors, social cohesion was a matter of literal life and death. You didn't survive without the tribe.
So if you leave the tribe, you die.
Right. If you signaled that you no longer aligned with your peers, you risked social excommunication. And that meant starving in the wilderness.
Wow, so the stakes were literally survival.
Exactly. So today, when you realize you are outgrowing someone, your ancient nervous system still registers that divergence as a mortal threat.
That is wild.
It is. Your brain floods you with guilt as an evolutionary mechanism to basically force you back into alignment with the group.
That makes so much sense, and it perfectly explains what we're calling the missing villain problem.
Yes, the missing villain.
When nobody actually did anything malicious, the brain just short circuits because there's no dramatic fight.
No obvious betrayal.
Right. There's no stolen money or broken trust where you can stand up and self-righteously say, I am protecting myself from your toxicity.
Because the brain operates as a predictive machine. It craves a clear cause and effect narrative to make sense of the world.
It wants a neat little story.
Exactly. A clear reason for distance provides neurological closure. If your friend betrays you, you have a solid, logical narrative for why the relationship is terminating.
But if they're just a good person?
Right. When they are a genuinely good, kind person who simply no longer resonates with your life, there is an error signal in the brain.
It's just a slow fade.
Exactly. The distance is creeping in, but it's just the accumulation of tiny, imperceptible shifts over time. That lack of a villain forces you to sit with agonizing discomfort.
Because sometimes things just expire without a dramatic catalyst. It's kind of like tectonic plates, you know?
Oh, I love that analogy.
Like for years, you and this friend are part of the exact same landmass. But beneath the surface, the magma, like your core values and life philosophies, is pulling in opposite directions.
Moving at a glacial pace.
Right. It's moving at like 1 millimeter a year. It's completely imperceptible on a daily basis. Until one day, 5 years later, you look across the gap and realize there is an entire ocean between you.
That is a phenomenal mechanistic way to look at it. Because with tectonic drift, neither plate is moving wrong.
It's just doing its thing.
It is just geology. And yet we stand on the edge of our newly formed continent, looking at the other side, feeling paralyzed by the guilt that we can't bridge the gap anymore.
So true. But if we know it's just tectonic drift, I want to figure out how we fix the language.
Language is so important here.
It is. Because I still struggle with saying I grew them. Is there a more clinical, accurate way to frame this so we don't feel like we're being inherently arrogant?
The shift in terminology is critical for our own cognitive framing. Shifting from "I've outgrown them" to "we've grown apart" completely alters the emotional landscape.
Oh, that feels so much lighter. We've grown apart.
Right. We've grown apart acknowledges mutual horizontal change. It completely removes the blame and the hierarchy.
It takes the ego right out of it.
Exactly. It doesn't imply a victor and a loser in the race of personal development. It simply acknowledges two organisms adapting to different environments.
Which begs the question, why are we so terrified of growing apart in the first place?
It's a deeply ingrained fear.
I think it comes down to a societal myth we've all been sold since we were literally children on the playground. We are obsessed with the myth of forever.
Oh, absolutely. We are entirely conditioned by a cultural script of best friends forever.
It's everywhere.
It's etched into middle school yearbooks. It's the premise of every romantic comedy, and it forms the bedrock of our social expectations.
So if a friendship doesn't last until we're 80, it failed.
That's how we're conditioned to see it. We subconsciously measure the success of any relationship by its longevity.
Which is so unfair.
It is. If a friendship ends after 5 years, society subtly frames it as a failure, a broken bond. But from a developmental psychology standpoint, the idea that every close relationship should last forever is mathematically and emotionally absurd.
Because we aren't the same people.
Not at all.
I am utterly fascinated by this concept from the sources of seasonal relationships. The idea that humans are sometimes meant to serve as scaffolding for very specific chapters of each other's lives.
Yes, scaffolding is a great word for it.
Like you have the coworkers who help you survive a deeply toxic job. You bond in the trenches, you form an intense trauma bond, but once one of you gets a new job, the scaffolding isn't needed anymore.
Or the friend who was your absolute lifeline during a brutal breakup.
Right. But then 5 years later, you have nothing to talk about. And that feels like a failure, but it's not.
We struggle immensely with this because of how we attribute value. We falsely conflate longevity with meaning.
Wow, conflating longevity with meaning. That's powerful.
But think about the neurobiology of human development. A mentor might interact with you for exactly 6 months, but in that time, they challenge your worldview so profoundly that they literally alter your neural pathways.
They change the whole trajectory.
Exactly. They change the trajectory of your entire career. The relationship doesn't have to stretch into a 50-year timeline for the impact to be permanent.
The changes remain.
The structural changes they made to your life remain long after your paths diverge.
So for you, listening to us right now, I want you to think about someone who was your absolute center of gravity a few years ago.
Someone you were really close to.
Yeah, someone who knew every mundane detail of your day, who you maybe barely interact with now. Does that silence today magically erase the profound comfort they gave you back then?
Of course not.
Does the fact that you aren't close right now mean they didn't help forge the exact version of you that exists today? No. The history is completely secure.
That is the healthiest possible framing. It allows you to validate the past without forcing it to dictate the present.
It's like letting them stay in that chapter.
Exactly. You can hold immense, overwhelming gratitude for a person's role in chapter 4 of your life without feeling obligated to drag them into chapter 10 when they just no longer fit the plot.
I completely agree with the theory, but let me push back a little bit because here is where the rubber meets the road and it gets a bit dangerous.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
We've established that people drift, and that's fine.
Right.
But it is incredibly easy to say, oh, I'm just growing, I'm evolving, when in reality, I'm just becoming an arrogant jerk who abandons people.
It happens more often than we like to admit.
Right. So how do we ensure that growth isn't just a mask for superiority?
This requires a highly uncomfortable level of self-interrogation. Let's look at a very common scenario.
Okay, set the scene.
Imagine you and a friend historically bonded over a shared cynicism. You know, late nights, drinking, and endlessly complaining about your dead-end jobs.
Oh, I've definitely had those friendships. The shared grievance is the glue.
Exactly. The shared grievance was the social glue. Then you experience a shift. You decide to prioritize your physical health. You start waking up early. You actively pursue career advancement.
The 5 a.m. alarm lifestyle.
Yes. And you want conversations focused on ideas rather than complaints. Your friend, meanwhile, is perfectly content remaining in the old dynamic.
Which is their right.
It is. But the trap here is the immediate temptation to look down on them.
Right. You start feeling incredibly enlightened with your green smoothies, and you look at them like they are a lost cause.
You start judging them for not changing with you.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. If I am doing all this intense psychological and physical work to improve my baseline, and I decide to cut off people who drain me because they don't match my new ambition, isn't that just me protecting my peace?
That's a very common defense.
Because the modern wellness industry tells us constantly, distance yourself from low vibration people, protect your energy. Isn't distancing myself a sign of health?
That specific weaponization of wellness language is something psychologists are increasingly concerned about.
Weaponization.
Really? Yes. If your so-called personal growth turns into a brittle inability to tolerate anyone who chooses to live differently than you, it hasn't actually morphed into growth. It has morphed into ego.
Oh, wow. That is a gut punch.
True differentiation, which is a concept from Murray Bowen's family systems theory, is the ability to remain emotionally connected to others while maintaining your own distinct identity and principles.
Hold on, say that again, because that flips the entire cut toxic people out narrative on its head.
If you are genuinely secure in your own growth, you do not require everyone around you to mirror your choices in order to feel validated.
So I don't need them to drink the green smoothie.
Exactly. You don't have to evangelize ambition just because you became ambitious. If you only exist in an echo chamber of people who are exactly as optimized as you are, your peace isn't protected.
It's just fragile.
It is incredibly fragile. True psychological growth allows you to say, I am choosing a path of intense career focus, and I completely respect that you are choosing a path of comfort and familiar routines without feeling personally threatened by their choice.
That is a total paradigm shift. It really forces you to look in the mirror and ask, am I becoming more disciplined or am I just becoming less tolerant?
It's a tough question to ask yourself.
But let's flip the scenario. If we can reach that Zen state of accepting our friends without forcing them to change, what happens when they refuse to accept us?
That is the other side of the coin.
What happens when the history of the friendship is actively used as a weapon against our new goals? Because tectonic drift is one thing, but someone actively holding you back is another entirely.
Now we are entering what behavioral economists and psychologists would recognize as a sunk cost fallacy, specifically applied to relationships.
So the 20-year trap.
We can definitely call it the 20-year trap. In our previous example, the friend was just living their life. But imagine a scenario where the friend actively mocks your evolution.
Like making fun of you for trying to change.
Exactly. You say you want to go back to school, and they belittle your intelligence. You try to save money, and they aggressively guilt trip you for being cheap and ruining the fun.
They're threatened by the change.
They actively attempt to sabotage your new baseline to pull you back to theirs.
And the craziest part of human psychology is that if a stranger at a networking event spoke to us like that, we would turn on our heel and never speak to them again.
Without a second thought.
But because this is a friend from elementary school, because we shared a dorm room in college, we just absorb the disrespect. We get completely ensnared in this history fallacy.
The history fallacy relies heavily on loss aversion. Humans are biologically wired to fear losing an established resource, like a 20-year social bond, far more than we value the potential gain of a healthier environment.
We just think about the sunk cost.
We think, if I walk away now, I've wasted 2 decades of investment. But history is not a lifetime license for disrespect.
I need that on a t-shirt.
Knowing someone for 20 years does not grant them immunity from your current boundaries. We frequently confuse shared history with genuine loyalty.
They're not the same thing.
True loyalty is actively supporting your continuing evolution, not chaining you to the ghost of who you were 10 years ago.
So how do we actually diagnose this in real time? Because when a friend makes a passive-aggressive joke about your new diet, you might just laugh it off nervously in the moment to keep the peace.
It's a defense mechanism.
Right. You don't immediately recognize it as sabotage. How do we objectively measure if a long-term relationship has actually become toxic?
You need a diagnostic tool that bypasses your immediate social conditioning. When you are sitting across from someone you've known forever, your brain falls into highly practiced, automatic neurological grooves.
You just slip back into the old dynamic.
You play your side role, so you won't accurately gauge the toxicity while in their presence. The critical data collection happens after you leave. We call this the after-interaction audit.
I absolutely love this concept. Walk me through the mechanics of the audit.
Okay, picture this.
I just had a 2-hour lunch with my oldest friend. I walk out to the parking lot, I get in my car, and I shut the door. What exactly am I looking for in that silence?
You are looking for physiological and emotional markers. First, assess your energy baseline.
My energy.
Do you feel a sense of lightness and energized engagement, which correlates with oxytocin and serotonin release? Or do you feel a heavy, crushing sense of depletion, like you need to take a 3-hour nap?
Oh man, that exhausted feeling. I know it well.
That exhaustion is often the physiological toll of masking.
Masking, meaning the sheer caloric effort of performing a version of myself that doesn't exist anymore just to avoid conflict with them.
Precisely. You ask yourself during that lunch, could I be my authentic present-day self? Or was I forced to put on the costume of my 22-year-old self to keep the peace?
That is such a good question to ask.
Furthermore, look at your willingness to share. Were you actively hiding things you were proud of, like a promotion, a new relationship, or a personal victory?
Because you just knew they'd shoot it down.
Because you subconsciously knew it would be met with cynicism or subtle jealousy? If you have to shrink your reality to fit into their presence, the audit has failed.
So the relationship is over.
Well, as a caveat, one bad lunch doesn't mean you terminate a lifelong friendship.
Right.
But if this audit consistently returns negative results over months, you have hard internal data that the relationship is actively harming your psychological well-being.
Okay, so the audit comes back negative. You realize this person is draining you, and you naturally start creating distance.
Which is the healthy response.
But this is where the brain plays a really cruel trick on us. Once there is distance, we start to experience this agonizing nostalgia, and we desperately try to reconnect.
The nostalgia trap.
I want to dissect this because why do we relentlessly try to go backward into relationships that we already proved were draining us?
The urge to reconnect is driven by a powerful cognitive bias called the fading effect bias.
Fading effect bias. Okay, what is that?
The human brain is not a purely objective hard drive. It is a survival engine. And for survival, it is evolutionarily advantageous to process and eventually dampen the visceral sting of negative memories while preserving positive ones.
Oh, to keep us from just giving up.
Exactly. This keeps us moving forward rather than being paralyzed by past trauma.
So our own biology is basically gaslighting us.
In a sense, yes, it really is. When you create distance from a friend, your hippocampus and amygdala get to work.
They start editing.
Over a few years, they selectively prune the emotional weight of the arguments, the subtle put-downs, and that exhaustion you felt in your car.
But we remember the good stuff perfectly.
What remains highly salient are the spontaneous road trips, the inside jokes, the profound moments of connection. Nostalgia acts as an aggressive filter, editing out the reality of why you left.
And what makes this even more complex is this incredible revelation from the source material about what we are actually missing.
This is key.
Sometimes I don't think we are actually missing the old friend at all. We're missing who we were when we were with them.
That is the crux of the trap. It's a phenomenon closely related to identity foreclosure.
How so?
When you look back at a friend from your early 20s, you aren't just remembering them. You are remembering your own lack of a mortgage, your lack of chronic back pain, the sheer intoxicating potential of having your whole life ahead of you.
Wow. They just represent that time.
The friend ceases to be a complex, flawed human being in your mind, and they become a symbolic avatar for a bygone era of your own life.
It's exactly like driving back to your childhood home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can walk through the physical space. You can stand in the kitchen where you used to eat cereal before school.
But it's not the same.
Right. You can't magically become a carefree 10-year-old again just by standing near the refrigerator.
The magic wasn't the drywall.
Exactly. The magic was that specific, unrepeatable time in your life. We project our grief for our lost youth onto these old friends.
That is a brilliant analogy. And trying to force a reconnection with the friend is like trying to move back into that childhood kitchen and expecting your adult anxieties to just vanish.
Which never works.
And modern technology has turned this natural grieving process into an absolute psychological minefield.
Oh, social media. We have to talk about how social media completely scrambles our neurochemistry when it comes to outgrowing people.
It changes everything.
Historically, if you outgrew someone, they eventually just faded into the background. You might hear a rumor about them 5 years later, but out of sight, out of mind.
There was natural closure.
Today, you have a high-definition 247 front-row seat to the daily lives of people you haven't had a real conversation with in a decade.
The specific psychological danger of social media here is that it provides information without intimacy.
Information without intimacy. That is dangerous.
Seeing former friends' highly curated posts, their vacations, their wedding, their new friend group, it triggers a deeply unsettling phantom limb pain.
It feels like you should still be there.
Your brain recognizes the face, remembers the historical intimacy, but registers the current profound disconnection. It creates a vacuum of context.
And nature abhors a vacuum. So we fill it with totally fictional stories.
We invent the rest.
We see 3 photos of them laughing on a boat with strangers, and we immediately construct a narrative. They are living a perfect, joyous life. They have seamlessly replaced me, and I have lost something utterly irreplaceable.
When in reality, it's just a photo.
We are literally grieving a fictional relationship built out of curated pixels.
Exactly. You are comparing your messy, complex, unedited present reality with their highlight reel, all viewed through the distorted lens of fading effect bias.
Which is a guaranteed recipe for depressive rumination.
It absolutely is.
So given all these traps, the fading effect bias, the social media illusions, how do we practically handle the reality of the present?
We need practical steps.
Right. If we recognize we've outgrown someone, do we need to formally break up with them? Do I need to sit them down, look them in the eye, and officially terminate the friendship?
This brings us to a major misconception in modern relational dynamics. We call it the formal breakup myth.
The formal breakup myth.
We have been conditioned to believe that closure requires a grand, definitive conversation. We feel pressure to handle a fading friendship like the termination of a corporate contract.
It's like an exit interview.
Exactly. But sitting someone down to explicitly list the reasons why you no longer resonate with them is almost always unnecessary, and frankly, it is often a deeply cruel exercise in ego.
Right. Saying, I've evaluated our bond and found you lacking effective immediately, isn't closure. It's just inflicting pain to relieve your own anxiety about the ambiguity.
Precisely. The vast majority of the time, the healthiest approach is to simply allow the tide to go out.
Let the tide go out. I like that.
People naturally become less present in each other's lives. You stop initiating as much, the responses get a bit longer, the plans become more infrequent.
And that's okay.
It is perfectly acceptable and deeply humane to let the tide go out without standing on the beach with a megaphone announcing its departure.
But wait, we have to address the idea of frequency versus depth. Because I think people feel guilty letting the tide go out because they equate talking every day with being a good friend.
That is a critical reframing we need to do. We falsely equate physical or communicative frequency with emotional depth.
They aren't the same.
Not at all. You can speak to a coworker every single day for 8 hours, sharing nothing but complaints about the coffee machine and surface-level gossip.
Very high frequency, very low depth.
That is a highly frequent, incredibly shallow relationship. Conversely, you might have a friend from college who you speak to twice a calendar year.
But when you do
pick up the phone, within 60 seconds, you are discussing your deepest fears, your marital struggles, your existential doubts.
You just pick up right where you left off.
The depth of a relationship is defined by the safety and vulnerability present when connection occurs, not by the sheer volume of text messages sent.
That is incredibly freeing. It means I don't have to maintain a daily text thread to honor a deep friendship.
It relieves so much pressure.
But what happens if the other person notices the tide going out and they panic?
That does happen.
Say you've been naturally pulling back and you get the dreaded text, hey, you've been so distant lately. Did I do something wrong? Are you mad at me? You can't just ghost them at that point.
No, absolutely not.
How do we communicate this tectonic drift without destroying them?
When directly confronted, you transition from natural fading to a strategy of kindly, honest communication.
Kindly honest. Okay.
The goal of advanced communication in this scenario is boundary setting without rejection. If they ask if they did something wrong, you must resist the urge to air 5 years of accumulated grievances.
Keep the list to yourself.
Yes, you can rely on highly specific de-escalating scripts.
Okay, let's role play this because I want to hear exactly how this sounds. I'll be the anxious friend.
Okay, I'm ready.
I text you, hey, you never invite me out anymore. Did I do something to upset you? What is the exact response?
You respond, no, you absolutely didn't do anything wrong. I've just been going through some internal changes recently, and I'm navigating a lot of shifting priorities right now.
Wow. That is brilliant. Navigating shifting priorities.
It's very effective.
It completely removes them from the crosshairs. It makes the distance about my internal capacity, not their external flaws.
Exactly. It's about you, not them.
What if they push harder, though? But we used to have so much fun, we never hang out like we used to.
Then you employ the strategy of validating the past while firmly asserting the present.
How does that sound?
You say, I deeply value everything we've been through, and I will always appreciate our history together. But I think our lives have just evolved in different directions recently.
Okay, that's really solid.
Or the most universally applicable phrase, we're just in different places in life right now.
And it's vital to clarify that different places does not mean geography.
No, not at all.
It's not about moving to a new city. It means we are inhabiting different emotional, professional, or psychological zip codes.
Exactly. It is a compassionate acknowledgement of divergent paths. And this exact framework applies to micro-boundaries within active relationships as well.
Give me an example of a micro-boundary.
Suppose you have a friend who still operates on the old dynamic of endless venting and drama. They call you for the 3rd time in a week to complain about their partner.
And you just don't want to hear it again.
Instead of snapping and attacking their character by saying, you are so toxic, you never stop complaining, advanced communication allows you to establish a boundary around yourself.
What do you say?
You say, I really want to support you, but I simply don't have the emotional energy to dive into this tonight.
The distinction there is massive. You are toxic is a judgment. It invites immediate defensiveness and an argument.
It's an attack.
Right. But I don't have the emotional energy is an inarguable statement about my own internal reservoir.
And this reveals a profound truth about relational health. A truly healthy connection can survive the introduction of a boundary.
That's a great test.
If you state, I don't have the capacity for this right now, and the other person reacts with rage, guilt trips you, or accuses you of being a terrible friend, they are handing you vital, undeniable data about the dysfunction of the connection.
They're showing their true colors.
But if they respect the boundary, the relationship demonstrates the plasticity needed to survive your mutual evolution.
Okay, we spent a lot of time on friendships, but we have to shift gears to the most terrifying application of this entire concept.
I know where you're going with this.
Friendships drifting is sad, but romantic drift is devastating. Let's talk about what happens when the person you are outgrowing is someone you share a life, a home, or a family with.
It's incredibly painful.
Because it is entirely possible to profoundly outgrow someone while still being deeply in love with them.
This is undoubtedly the most agonizing iteration of outgrowing a peer. We are steeped in a romanticized cultural narrative that dictates love conquers all.
If you love them, it should work out right.
We believe that if the love is authentic, the relationship must inherently survive. But clinical psychology draws a very sharp distinction between love and compatibility.
They're not the same thing.
Love is an emotional state. It is neurochemically driven by oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin. Compatibility, however, is a structural reality. It is the architectural vessel that actually holds the love.
I love that visual. You can have an ocean of love, the purest water in the world. But if the vessel of compatibility is shattered, the water just spills out onto the floor.
It can't be contained.
It can't sustain you. What are the actual structural elements of that vessel?
The vessel is constructed from shared core values, aligned conflict resolution styles, mutual long-term lifestyle goals, financial philosophies, and crucially, timing.
Timing is huge.
Timing is often the silent assassin of profound love. You can have two exceptionally good human beings who possess a deep, genuine love for one another.
But they're just off sync.
But if, after 5 years, One partner requires the stability of a suburban home and children to feel fulfilled, and the other realizes their authentic path requires a nomadic life of unpredictable entrepreneurship. The structural vessel is broken.
The love didn't die.
The love has not diminished, but the individuals have become fundamentally incompatible.
Which brings us to why leaving these relationships feels like tearing your own heart out.
It's excruciating.
If a partner betrays you, if they cheat on you or abuse you, you are handed a villain. The anger spikes. And anger is a high arousal, action-oriented emotion.
It acts like rocket fuel.
Exactly. It propels you to pack your bags, slam the door, and drive away. But what happens when the person is wonderful, gentle, and you still love them, but your tectonic plates are just moving apart?
In that scenario, you are entirely denied the momentum of anger. You don't get the rocket fuel.
You just have to sit in it.
Instead, you are forced to cultivate acceptance. And acceptance is a low arousal, deeply grief-oriented state.
That sounds exhausting.
Acceptance requires sitting quietly with the excruciating realization that continuing to stay would require one of you to permanently amputate a core part of your authentic self just to keep the relationship intact.
Wow. Amputate a core part of yourself.
Leaving a partnership not because you hate them, but because you love them enough to not force them to shrink is one of the most mature, psychologically demanding acts a human being can undertake.
That is incredibly heavy, but also weirdly beautiful.
Yeah.
It honors the love by not forcing it to become a cage.
Exactly.
But let me ask you this. Is every tectonic drift an automatic death sentence? If my partner and I are moving at completely different speeds or developing totally different interests, is the relationship just doomed?
Not necessarily, no.
How do people stay married for 50 years when they are constantly evolving into different people?
This is where we introduce the ultimate antidote to relational drift. It's the pivot from judgment to curiosity.
Judgment to curiosity. Tell me about that.
When a partner or a friend adopts a new value, a new hobby, or a new worldview that is radically different from your own, the default neurological response is often threat detection.
Which manifests as judgment.
Exactly. You think, that's a ridiculous way to spend money, or that philosophy makes no sense. Judgment instantly builds a concrete wall between you.
It shuts down the connection because you are basically saying my reality is correct and yours is flawed.
Exactly. But if you can consciously override that instinct and replace judgment with genuine curiosity, the entire dynamic transforms.
How does that look in practice?
Instead of building a wall, you throw a bridge across the tectonic gap. You say to them, I wouldn't make that choice for my own life, and I don't fully understand it yet, but I want to know why it matters so deeply to you.
I wouldn't choose that, but I want to understand. That is such a masterclass in differentiation.
Because you aren't sacrificing yourself.
Right. You aren't abandoning your own values. You aren't pretending to agree. You are holding your ground as an individual, but you are leaning in to observe their internal world.
You do not need the people you love to be carbon copies of you to maintain profound intimacy.
Thank goodness for that.
You just require a baseline of mutual respect and a relentless commitment to remaining interested in their evolution.
So curiosity is the key.
The longest-lasting relationships survive massive tectonic shifts because both individuals maintain neuroplasticity in how they view each other. They continue to ask open-ended questions.
They don't assume.
They never succumb to the arrogance of assuming they have their partner completely figured out. The moment you believe you know exactly who your partner is, you stop being curious.
And when curiosity dies, the relationship suffocates.
Precisely.
It is the assumption of familiarity that actually kills us. We think, I've known you for 10 years, I know every thought in your head.
Which is never true.
But if we actively choose to approach them as a slightly new, evolving person every few years, we keep the oxygen flowing in the relationship.
That's the secret to longevity.
As we pull all of these threads together, I want to briefly highlight the linguistic toolkit we've been building today. Because navigating these murky, guilt-ridden emotional waters requires immense precision in our language.
Language gives us a roadmap.
So often, we feel completely overwhelmed by the drift because we simply lack the vocabulary to articulate the nuance of our grief without sounding like a villain.
Having precise language acts as a psychological scaffolding. When you replace "you've changed" with "we're in different places," or you replace "you are too much" with "I don't have the capacity," you are empowering yourself to handle shifting dynamics with immense grace.
It takes the sting out of it.
It allows you to assert your reality without inflicting unnecessary cruelty. It is the essence of being kindly honest.
So if there is a core liberating truth to synthesize from everything we've explored today, it is this. You do not have to hate someone to let them go. You do not need a villain to validate your departure. You don't have to erase the past or pretend those memories weren't beautiful and foundational to accept that the present has irrevocably changed.
The evolution of a relationship, even its ultimate conclusion, is not a symptom of failure. It is very often a symptom of life, unfolding, adapting, and growing exactly as it is biologically and psychologically meant to.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over today.
Oh, I like this one.
Think about your life, your cognitive bandwidth, and your emotional energy as a crowded room. There's a finite amount of square footage in there. There's only so much time and love you have to give.
We'll have limits.
What if the empty space created by growing apart from someone today, that vacant chair at the table that really hurts to look at right now, what if that is the exact necessary space required for the people you're supposed to meet in your next chapter to actually find you?
That's a beautiful way to frame it.
If our lives are a crowded room, maybe someone naturally has to step out for the next great mentor, the next profound partner, or the next lifelong friend to be able to step in.
We have to make space for the future.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us today on this deep dive. We hope this conversation offered you a new framework, some practical tools, and maybe a little bit of peace regarding the shifting relationships in your own life.
Yes, thank you for being here with us.
Until our next conversation, take care of yourselves, stay deeply curious, and remember to protect your space with kindness. Goodbye.